So hello, thank you for being here today. Thank you for the invitation. So we're going to talk about biodiversity conservation, these beautiful vineyards in Chile, which are not the exception. This is Montes wine, and about our planet. So I'm not going to go in again saying that we are confronting tremendous changes in this planet, which is the only one we have, by the way. And it's not only about climate change. We are in front of the 6th mass extinction, and we are the ones that made it, not how it happened with dinosaurs. We are making these changes. If we look at this other beautiful satellite image, which is November of 2016, so it's my summer, what I will look in here, this is not the net primary productivity. That means all the energy and carbon that has been sequestered in this vegetation, in the terrestrial ecosystem. And what does this mean, a part of this beauty? This means carbon, less emissions in the atmosphere. This means evapotranspiration. This concentration of vegetation drives the climate. This means oxygen. And this means also food for us. Well, 40% of what you see here is managed by us humans, mainly through agriculture. Therefore, when we talk about conservation, I'm not really talking about hugging trees necessarily. I'm talking that when we eat, we consume, we are responsible of changes as important as climate, as biodiversity, as oxygen, okay? So our decisions matter a lot. And why this is so important? Because ecosystems, healthy ecosystems, when they function properly, they deliver ecosystem services, or how we call it now, that it's nature contributions to people. Okay, so by functioning, several vertebrates and insects pollinate, and we need pollination for most of our food and crops. Landscapes and beauty is related with our cultural identity in many different cultures in the world, or pure water, which is something that we get from watersheds or ice melting, for example, mostly in Chile. So what's the point here? That in the climate change scenario and habitat loss, we, by getting these big changes in temperature and regime precipitations, we are confronting changes in distribution of species. Therefore, there are changes in the distribution and provision of ecosystem services. In that sense, there are several ecosystem services that are related with climate change mitigation, for example. So if we lose a lot of forest, then we're going to be losing carbon, basically. And when we lose wetlands, for example, then we are losing less, we're having less flood mitigation. And there are other ecosystem services that we can lose because of these changes in species distribution that are related with production, you see? And that means climate change adaptation. If we don't have that, then we are not in good shape to confront these changes. Now, we can think, and we have been talking these days, that we can move viticulture. We can move crops. We can switch from varieties. The problem is that we cannot move the ecosystem that sustain that production. And sometimes it seems that we forget about that. We cannot move ecosystem services unless we keep the species that provide them. So by conserving and sustainably managing biodiversity, not only within protected areas, which is what we are accustomed to do, but also in human-dominated systems like what were the vineyards, for example, that is critical to address climate change, okay? So we need to move conservation beyond conservation areas, protected areas. You know this map. Well, this is a paper that we co-authored with Kim Nichols and other colleagues some time ago. And what you're looking here is Mediterranean climates and Mediterranean ecosystems. And we know that for long, wine has been there. We also know that Mediterranean ecosystems, for example, are very vulnerable to climate change. But also we know that Mediterranean ecosystems are part of the 35 places in the world that are called biodiversity hotspots, and that they are a priority for conservation worldwide. The reason why is that they have high diversity, high rates of endemisms. That means that there are species that you can find only in those places, and that they have a lot of threats. Threats because if you look only the 5 Mediterranean ecosystems that I'm showing you there, only 4.2% of that surface is under any protected area scheme, okay? So what do we do about it? If we move in Chile further, and we look protected areas here, these bars, so this is the north, like San Pedro Atacama, if you know, like, you know, Torres del Paine here. And in the middle, as you can see, there are no bars because we have no protected areas. Less than 1% of our Mediterranean ecosystem is protected by law. But who's there? Wineries. So in purple, you see vineyard distributions in Chile. So we invited wine industry 10 years ago to work with us in a conservation project because they are a very charismatic product of the Mediterranean in general, and especially it's a part of the image of Chile. They were already modifying their practices because they export a lot, so they were moving into greener markets, to say it in a way. And they have this fantastic concept of terroir. So we created this program, which is basically a scientific initiative. So I'm not a viticulturist, I'm an ecologist. And our aim, as Joao said, is to make wine and conservation compatible endeavors for conservation in Chile. We do research because we are scientists, and our main focus and main question is to understand how landscapes can continue to provide ecosystem services both to the industry and the community under these changing scenarios. And our main goal is to stimulate ecosystem-based management. That means looking into, you know, the cycles of nature, and so to provide evidence to make better decisions by our producers. For this, the first thing to do is to get to this big challenge, which is conciliate views. Because when we talk about biodiversity conservation, we think in, you know, this kind of image, which is part of biodiversity conservation, of course. And when we talk about productivity, then people get to this other image. These are very difficult images to put together, no? So if we don't leave these extremes, we are not going to move forward into workable solutions. So if we move to the wine again, this beautiful place is Kalytero Vineyard. So the historical view of growers had been that when 10 years ago I approached them, then the description was, yes, this is the productive land, this is the non-productive land, which is our native forest. But the view for us as ecologists is that these two ecosystems are only one, and they are connected. And what we see in this other area is carbon sequestration, water yield inside the vineyards, natural pest control, etc. So if we put nature and vineyards together, we can work together. But for that, we need to co-develop scientific questions, not the questions that I only need so that I can publish a paper and then get more money for the second grant, but questions that are also relevant for them. So the first things that we have been doing is defining protected areas inside the vineyards. For example, this is a Cono Sur vineyard. Also, we have been very strong, you know, trying to control exotic invasive species. As you can see here, this is Echolcia californica, which is used as cover crop, and it's an invasive species in Chile, although it's a beautiful and, you know, state flower of California. Because of that, we were in the need of developing native cover crops, because we would say, you know, you are using the incorrect cover crop. So they said, okay, tell me what I'm going to do, what should I use? But there are no native cover crops in Chile, so we had to take the quest. And we have been working 3 years inside this big program, no? We have been working to develop these native cover crops with native species, as I was saying. A knowledge transfer program and strategy evaluation also is something that we have been doing very strongly these 10 years, and I'll show you a bit more about. So, at almost the 3rd year, we have been doing research, but we began establishing good practices based on the research that we have done in their vineyards. Okay? So also we have been evaluating their effectiveness. So we created a book for them. It's a very small book. It's like a booklet with practices, like the examples that we have here. For example, how to improve habitat connectivity for different species, how to identify and control invasive species, and look for strategies that would make affordable the control of invasive species, which is quite expensive. And for that, we have learned a lot from South Africa. And, for example, how we should manage protected areas, avoiding other, thoughts like putting animals in the forest or things like that, that is known in Chile, or thought, people in Chile think, that will prevent fires, which is not the truth. That brings a lot of invasive species of grass into the forest, and then cows eat the forest, then we have fires when we have less forest, basically. Yeah? So we have been doing that kind of stuff. We have, of course, to publish papers. And so we run all research, as I was saying, which is important for us to get other grants and to stay there, for things like studying bird diversity in vineyards, to microbial terroir, to understand microbial terroir, what you use, basically. But for example, in this paper, what we were looking, we were talking about like a fundamental question in ecology, which is, do microbes have biogeography? Do fungi or bacteria live everywhere in the world, or do they live in special places? Well, we developed that in vineyards. So when we get the response, we're also talking about the terroir. Okay? So it's 2 for 1. You see, we co-develop research questions. And we also have some social sciences involved in the way that we can evaluate if our strategy is being effective or not. That is part of our philosophy then, the knowledge transfer, and that we get science to everybody. And the workshops is one of our basic tools that we use to make this knowledge transfer. How we do it? We use something that we call inquiry methodologies, which is basically learn by doing. It's basically the scientific method, but simplified. And there's one called Ecology in the Schoolyard. So we are in Napaltawa Vineyard here, talking about soil compactation. We all know that soil compactation is very bad. So we would go with that recommendation. But why is bad? So here, basically, we are using very sophisticated instruments, as you can see, to prove that effectively habitat compactation, soil compactation, is different in the forest, in the vineyard, and in a road. Here we're using other techniques that are used in ecology with simple methods to understand functioning, like, for example, coverage, or how compost and temperature determines, decomposition. And something different also and interesting that we do is that, for example, we make all these exercises to understand the points of view. If you are a bird or if you are a little insect, you perceive the landscape in a different way. So if you want to develop a biological corridor, for example, then you need to target the species and make a biological corridor according to the movement of that species. And this encourages then so that when they invest in something that is related with conservation, that will work because it's based on scientific evidence. Then we see where we put these kind of practices. We get all together and make different scenarios. If you have a lot of money, you don't have a lot of money in your vineyard, how can you do that? And what we have seen is that our growers, the companies that are working with us, they achieve better and they incorporate more conservation practices than the control group. And then when we get to evaluate our workshops, we know that even 2 different forms of workshops increase their knowledge. So this means time 0 when they haven't had the workshop. This is after the workshop, immediately after the workshop, and this knowledge is what we can measure after 6 months after the workshop. So it seems that in terms of knowledge, which is not enough, I agree, we are doing well. Up to date, we have 26,499 hectares, sorry, 1,000 hectares of native forest, which is preserved by our producers. And if we see the rate, the average rate, for 1 hectare that is vineyard, in average, we have 3 hectares of conservation. Viña Paltagua, for example, has even 7 hectares for conservation per 1 production. And why is this important? For climate change mitigation, as our colleagues were talking yesterday, we can see that this is the amount of carbon that you have sequestered in the vineyard. This is in an average in our vineyards. And this is what you have 5 times more if you look into your native forest. So when you avoid eliminating, destroying the forest, basically reduce emission by avoiding deforestation, that is a very important issue when we come to conservation and climate change. Lastly, climate change adaptation, then, if we want to have that, we need multifunctional landscapes that will provide several ecosystem services. So when we make conservation in the vineyards, we are keeping natural pest control, we are keeping pollination for other species, we are keeping the potential for wild yeasts and lactic bacteria that we now know where they are, not only in the vineyard, they are also in the forest. And we keep the idea of the terroir, because we will need to adapt to climate change and move our vineyards. We are already doing that. What about the terroir? If we use, the full definition of OIV, which is quite complex, We have been able to replicate this. Today, the Code of Sustainability of Wines of Chile has our principles of conservation biodiversity. We have our ambassadors, so our people, Noelia, that's the enologist of Vineyards Emiliano, or Ignacio, they are both talking in a Cabernet Sauvignon vineyard, symposium in Napa, or they go into the government meetings to help us move this initiative to other sectors of agriculture. And finally, we have been beginning to get some recognition, international recognition, for our working of science that is working with the industry. So this is basic science, collaborating with the industry, which sometimes is something that we don't see. So I just wanted to end again with this beautiful photo and say that, of course, this is our planet Earth, and it's a marvelous and complex system. And we are essential part of it, but it's a system. So we cannot achieve climate change mitigation and adaptation if we don't look at the rest of the system. Every component is connected, and that's why I am saying that this is so important for climate change. We do have the science. We need more for sure, but we do have enough science now, and you have enough will, so we can definitely act now. So thank you very much for listening to me.